Welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast, presented by Orion Advisor Solutions and hosted by Dr. Daniel Crosby, Orion's Chief Behavioral Officer and New York Times best-selling author. Each week, Dr. Crosby interviews a fascinating new guest on a range of compelling topics, from literature to psychology to financial wellness. To learn more about Dr. Crosby's behavioral finance work at Orion, visit www.orion.com.
Hello and welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast. I am your host, Dr. Daniel Crosby. I'm joined today by Dr. Mary Bell Carlson. What is she a doctor of, you ask? Well, she has a bachelor's in poli-sci from BYU. She has a master's in financial planning from Texas Tech and a Ph.D. in financial planning with an emphasis in financial therapy from K-State. She teaches in financial planning at UGA and Texas Tech and started ChiefFinancialMom.com, a personal finance education platform aimed to help busy moms. Welcome, Dr. Mary.
Hey, good morning. How are you?
I am incredible. It's almost Thanksgiving. I am ready for some pecan pie. So life is good. Life is good.
Good. Well, thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be here today.
No, it's my pleasure. So we were talking recently about your work in, we'll keep it high level, your work with the government and the military and families and providing financial planning and financial therapy for those folks. And you've worked most of your career for people with top secret clearances, and you had some incredible stories about the specifics of doing financial planning and financial therapy for those with top secret clearances. Tell us what makes that work unique.
Sure. Yeah. Let me back up. I did my first entrance into the military was actually at the Pentagon's office of in the Secretary of Defense. I worked in the Office of Financial Education. So the first interest was going out and giving financial education to service providers, which was really an eye-opening experience. And then I went to Fort Riley, Kansas, and learned that the military is not full of stars, but a lot of it is on the ground, boots on the ground, enlisted. And during my time there, I got to specifically work with Army Community Service, where I was helping families of the fallen. And so there was a lot of emotion that was going on during that time. You would lose a service member, and there was lots of frustration and anger, and even a feeling of this is blood money, that they had received this large sum, but they had lost their loved one. Moving forward, I then that's where I began my work in financial therapy at Kansas State and decided to write my dissertation on the financial behaviors of soldiers before and after deployment. And during that time, I started to learn there's a lot that goes on. I remember specifically, Daniel, there was a chart they would track at Fort Riley before and after deployments. And there was one thing that always spiked, and that was financial matters. Like financial concerns, financial problems. And it was by far more than spouse abuse, more than child abuse or DUIs, any kind of problematic behaviors they were tracking. Financial was far higher than the rest, which kind of sparked my interest in asking these questions of what's going on behind the scenes. And as I got further into my work, I then transitioned into more of the intelligence community. And in my time there, so both on the military side and in the intelligence world, people have to hold top secret security clearances in order to have their jobs, in order to do what they do every day. And yet a key part of holding a top secret security clearance is your personal finances. And the reason for this is it is known that espionage, the number one reason why people commit espionage, is for financial reasons. Just a quick example, we had a friend a guy that we knew from church, and he just in the last few years had come under a lot of financial stress, had owned a large home, had left his job at one of the intel services, and had started just kind of doing his own consulting, but it wasn't coming together like he had planned. He still had children at home. There was a lot of turmoil of how he was going to be paid. And so over time, he had worked extensively with the Chinese and knew how to speak Chinese. And during the time, the Chinese pitched him, and he ended up getting a burner phone from the Chinese and thinking it was encrypted. And just a couple of years ago was raided and busted by the FBI. And all in all, what he had sold out, which is now going to be his entire life in prison, was for $25,000. So now his kids are going to grow up without a dad. He's going to be in prison. And all because he was feeling the pressure of his mortgage and of his personal finances. And it was going to be for $25,000. And so that's an extreme example, but these are the types of problems. You go to another one. Let me give you another example. One of the worst espionage cases of all times is someone named Aldrich Ames. And Aldrich Ames did a lot of damage during the 80s and even early 90s. Because of what he gave away, hundreds of assets were killed during this time. But it was interesting because what he was receiving on behalf of that, there's a lot of other things that go into play in these espionage cases, narcissism and other problematic psychological behaviors. But he kept receiving large sums of money, millions of dollars from the Russian government. And that's where eventually we couldn't catch him. The US was never able to really capture him and figure out who this was for years and years. In fact, an incredible book that talks about this is called Spies in the Family. And she talks she's actually the daughter of a intel officer, but really it kind of helps capture how long this went on, how hard it was to catch her. And I remember at the end of the day, I was listening to a discussion about how to capture him. So it's not as easy as saying, well, someone's making a lot of money here. There's a lot of blame. So he blamed a lot on his wife in this case, but she had a lot of money. And it's really quite hard to find and figure out. But money tends to be a primary driver in many of these espionage cases, which is why it's such an impactful thing for people to have their personal finances in order, because that will also either prevent you from getting a security clearance, or in all actuality, you could lose a security clearance over that.
I have too many follow-up questions. There's too much good stuff. I don't even know where to begin with this. So I have been through the process. One of my best friends worked for naval intelligence. And so when I was, 23, I think I had some people come to my apartment and ask me all these questions about my friend, if he had financial problems, if he had ever used drugs, and, was he honest, and, all these different things. And it was such an interesting experience. And I remember thinking, why all the questions about money, right? Like, I understand the other stuff, but at the time thinking, why all the questions about money? But that's the susceptibility. That's that point of entry, that point of weakness through which you can be compelled to do shady things, to sell out your country. That's incredible to understand. What are the implications, if we can overextend this metaphor a bit? What are the implications for those of us who are civilians, if you will? Are there other implications that you've learned about through studying these sort of extreme behaviors? Do we become susceptible, perhaps not to selling government secrets to our enemies, but do we become susceptible to other types of bad behavior if we ourselves let our financial house get out of order?
Absolutely. And I think that's where the rubber really meets the road is, and I want to explain this in a simple way, is it's the little things. It's very small. And I don't even think Aldrich Ames, who is one of the most notorious spies of all times, started out with that intention, right? He was a disgruntled employee that was upset about some things. And so he ended up selling out his country on behalf of this. And so one of the things I want to emphasize is that it's little things. It's little pieces here or there, or falling through, or not completing something. Let me give you another example. A friend of mine from years ago, unfortunately, was working in the banking industry and just started to let those little things slide, right? Started signing information on behalf of clients, started using information in inappropriate ways, social security numbers, setting up shell companies, types of things. Well, time passed, and several years later, the FBI raided his home at 6:00 in the morning, and he's now convicted of financial fraud, over $7 million in financial fraud. And I look back and I say, how does someone that is that good, he was a good person, we enjoyed him, he was still is great person to be around, yet how does it go from the little things all the way up to committing fraud? And I think it's It's in the little white lies we tell ourselves. And it's allowing those to be okay and making them our reality. So let me give you another example. I remember going and visiting him while he was in prison and just kind of talking through and saying, what happened? How did this come about? And it was interesting to hear his side of the story. I think so often in these cases, it's like good or bad, right? Right or wrong. And it's very easy for us as detectives or outside kind of TV watchers to say, oh, this person did a good thing, this person did a bad thing. But I don't think it's that generalizable. And I think this is where the nuance of it comes in. And hearing his story, as he walked me through the different things, he saw no wrong all along the way. He was helping out a client because they were too busy doing something. So he would just sign on their behalf, or someone had given him permission to use that. And so in his mind, as I heard his story, there was what his reality was is I was just doing a favor. I was helping them out. And on the company side, setting up the shell companies became something that said, oh, it was my next big thing, right? I just hadn't got there yet. And they shut me down before it could become this amazing, wonderful business, right? And yet you listen to the prosecutor side, and that's completely a different story. And so let me take this to a personal level, though, and the realization behind these stories is we all live in our own reality. Whether it's true or not, it's our reality, and we own it. And so let's take it into a marital relationship, right? So what's my reality? What are my lived experiences are very different than even my husband's. And so we can look at the same problem or the same situation. It doesn't even have to be a problem, but the same financial happening and view it in two very different ways. And where one might see it in this direction, the other one's completely different. And yet the problem lies in when we don't communicate about it. And when we start to hide those things, and this is what we start to call financial infidelity. And financial infidelity, we often relate to a marital relationship, but it doesn't have to be. It could be something as even sharing with a roommate, right? If you have a roommate or spouse, you start to hide money or things in relationships, married or not, that becomes problematic of the trust that is built in those relationships. So obviously the difference between a roommate and a marriage in trust relationships is very different. But if you start scaping out on your part of the rent, or in a marriage relationship, if you start hiding things and putting up accounts or putting up walls where the other spouse can't see it, that becomes problematic. Not that we have to be in each other's business 24/7 and you have to dictate every dollar that is spent, but I think communication and sharing our own shared realities and starting to have a shared experience instead of individual experiences is where you start to break down those barriers and see where those problems lie.
So, I'm really glad that you sort of bridged this from the criminal to the everyday, because I think it would be a mistake for listeners to go, oh, like this guy embezzled whatever, falsified millions of dollars. That's a world apart from anything that I would ever do. But if there's two things that I've seen consistently, right? Two things that I've seen consistently that people can justify almost any type of behavior, especially if it happens sort of incrementally over time. And then the second thing is that each and every one of us is just one sort of small lapse in judgment away from really bad stuff. Like, I'm listening to a podcast right now about a guy who robbed 30 banks in the Pacific Northwest. And it's like, he hurt his back playing hockey at work on his lunch break. He got hooked on pain pills and then off to the races. Like, there's this Disney dad who 2 years later is sticking up banks. And I do think, I don't mean to be depressing, but I do think it's interesting for all of us to consider that we're just a couple of bad choices away from some truly horrific stuff, and that people can really justify these behaviors if they're not careful. And I think it's a call to be vigilant in small things, right? To be vigilant and a person of your word in even really small ways. So I want to talk about this two realities thing. Is there a limit to this? Because like, I got to be honest, your friend kind of loses me at some point. It's like, it's like, well, okay, yes, you were helping out a client by signing their name. Like, I get that. Like, you were doing this to help out your client. They were busy. I believe you. But then at some point, when you've lined your pockets with a 7 figures worth of money, like, you kind of lost me. So again, bringing it back to a spousal relationship, if you and your partner have these different subjective realities, and you're 100% correct, like, we have these different subjective realities with our partners, what do we do to bridge that gap is one question. If there's an impasse, there's these different subjectivities, how do we bridge that gap? And is there ever a point where one person is just wrong? Like, is there ever a point where the one person is just like, this is just like the lies you're telling yourself, and like the layers of subterfuge are just too disconnected from reality?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that there's 2 parts of this, right? So one is it's communication from both ends, but 2 is asking the questions. So if you're the spouse, and we've talked about this before, I've heard this in some of your podcasts, is there's a dominant spouse and there's a less dominant spouse, right? And so focusing sometimes on that less dominant spouse, and it may be because they're feeling uncomfortable about money, they don't know as much, or there's other things going on. So let me make a point right here too. Financial behavior, because it is so complex, we try to simplify it in a very easy way for our minds to wrap our heads around these very complex topics, right? And so going back to the espionage idea, while I'm saying espionage is the number one reason, that is not the only one. There's so many layers to this. And so let me apply that same thing to hiding purchases. There's so many reasons behind this. Let me give you another example. There was a lady who came in and just in tears and came to me and said, we're getting a divorce and my husband has been doing our taxes for almost 2 decades, right? And he did everyone at church's taxes, and he's been doing taxes for individuals. She goes, I never looked at it. I just signed it and assumed he was doing the best by us. Well, he had committed tax fraud. And she now owed hundreds of thousands of dollars in back taxes. And so part of that is absolutely, do I think that the husband would have ever come out and said, hey, honey, I've been cheating on our taxes. Here you go. Right. I don't pretend that, and there's so many other maladaptive and poor behaviors and probably some mental health issues that are going on behind the scenes that we're not here to diagnose that. But going back to just the pure financial things is asking questions. So when something is too complex, in fact, let's go back to the 2006, 2007 mortgage downfall. When some of the top thinkers in the financial industry say these mortgage-backed securities were too complex for even us to understand, there's a problem with that. And that causes, so complexity is sometimes a symptom of hiding, right? Of not being open to things. And I think that as we go back and we simplify, for example, if she didn't understand what was going on, she needed to ask questions and say, what does this mean? How does this impact it? What do we do? And I'm not putting the blame on her by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it works both ways. You've got to be able to open up, but you also need to have those questions. And sometimes it takes a third party, a mediator of sort, whether that be a therapist or a mediator in that sense, but someone from the outside that can look and say, hey, how are you two communicating, or are you not? And that's where that breakdown happens. There's so many other issues that come beyond that.
Yeah, so you don't have to be a financial expert, I think, to know and appreciate a couple of sort of high-level meta-diagnostic ideas. Like, if you don't understand it, ask questions, right? And if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. Like, if you just held those 2 things, absent any sort of specific knowledge of the meat and potatoes of tax or investing or anything, I think you'd be well served, and you'd get to where you need to go. I want to follow up on this idea of financial infidelity that you touched on, because I think it's fascinating and it's nothing I know much about and nothing I've spoken about on the show before. How common is this? Like, how commonly do you see this?
Well, you don't see it until it's a problem, right? That's when people are bleeding and needing help. So, in an example, is it's like walking into an ER room until someone's like bleeding or shot or severely wounded, they're not going to go to an ER. And I would say the same thing with financial infidelity, whether it's your marriage is falling apart, or in some cases, the financial planner is the one calling this out. And I'll give you a couple of examples. I've had financial planners come to me and say, Mary, look, we are ready to fire these clients. They've got good cash flow. They have millions of dollars in assets or had, but they're outspending their assets. They're spending them faster than they can keep up with. And so they're not listening to our advice, right? And so in working with those clients, they said, you are our last hope. Here you go, right? And so as I sat down and I worked through some of these couples, part of it was not financial related at all. It was some of the things going on in their marriage, some of their personal. So one couple in particular, she had the majority of the cash flow. She was a doctor, and but he had a good income as well, and they were making over $500,000 a year. So if you looked at them on paper, you would say absolutely they'd make an ideal financial planning client. Well, the problem was, as you started to peel back the layers of the onion here, it became not only were they spending, but a part of it was the discord in their marriage became so problematic that it was almost like retribution. So money became a weapon that they used against one another, or they used to make themselves feel better, right? Because they weren't happy or they weren't satisfied in their marriage. And so they started spending. And when I say they, it would be he and she in different ways. And they wouldn't communicate about it. And eventually, I remember working with this one couple in particular, and I realized one of the biggest issues surrounding their marriage was he had an anger management issue. And it became a point that I couldn't move forward because we couldn't talk about it until he was able to handle that. And it was something that was out of my league. And so I had to do a referral at that point. In fact, while working for the government, one of the things we would see sometimes is what I would call a trifecta. So someone who had, usually it was alcohol abuse or prescription drug abuse, followed by financial. So there's gambling behaviors or other addictive financial behaviors, as well as probably marital problems came along with it or other mental health disorders. And so they would send them over to us, and we would I remember specifically, they would always kind of dump them with me first and say, okay, let's get the finances handled, as if the numbers would help fix all the other things. But I quickly realized in working with some of those clients, I couldn't help them. One is we had to stabilize them. And I think that was the most important. So until that, especially the addictive behavior. So when we're talking about drug addiction or alcohol addiction or even gambling or some psychological, pathological issue, you as a financial planner cannot fix that. And so getting those outside resources and being a team approach was vital. So in my case, I worked directly with that social worker to get them stabilized to where they were able to steer away from the alcohol long enough to have a conversation, to have those addictive behaviors, because it's only going to continue to play on. And then secondly, I'd work in tandem with psychologists. Sometimes we do joint sessions together. Often it would be apart, and then we'd talk about it. And of course, we had to have disclosure and sign off and let the client know that we were communicating. But it was a way to really help the client with three professionals, each overlooking what we do best. And so I would say definitely as a financial advisor, you're not in the place to be able to, and you said this before, you're not in the place that you can go and do therapy, right? That's not what we're trained to do. And so having in your, and I'm going to use quotes here, Rolodex, right? In our nowadays, our contacts, it's having also mental health professionals to help you bridge some of these gaps or help you make some of those achievements along the way, which can help sustain some of the financial resources or some of the problematic financial behaviors that you're seeing along the way.
So when I was doing therapy, I worked with a number of GPs, of course, who would refer clients to me. And what I found was that nationally, 25% of visits to a general practitioner result in a referral to a mental health professional. So much of what people present to a general practitioner for really has sort of a psychological underpinning. And I think there's a really good analog here. You're talking about all these behaviors, all these financial behaviors, which are symptomatic of a bigger, more fundamental underlying problem. And it would be, to say the least, a temporary fix to try and solve the financial problems when the underlying sort of psychological problem hasn't been solved. I think this is a call for financial advisors everywhere to do perhaps a better job of connecting with, whatever, addiction recovery professionals, mental health professionals, medical providers, whomever, to be that referral source, to be that quarterback to get them where they need to be, and to understand that these financial problems are not always an end unto themselves, but are symptomatic of something bigger.
Absolutely. And Daniel, let me add two things. One is I don't think it's a problem. It's problems. They're multiple often, and they don't come singular. The other thing is we already have something set up in our industry that many financial planners don't know about, and that's the Financial Therapy Association. So this is a place where financial planners and doctors and nurses and social workers and therapists have already come together and created an association to where they do collaborate on these exact same type of topics. And they have conferences, they have a journal, and I would highly recommend that you get involved with that, right? That you not only get involved, but you're aware of it and you're able to get a referral. If you don't want to be, or this is not, and I understand many financial planners are going to listen to this and say, oh, that is so not me. I'm staying far, far away from it. Totally fine. But know those resources are there. Know that they exist, and know when you need to hand off or to be able to work in a collaborative way to get the help that your client needs.
Yeah, I can personally vouch for the Financial Therapy Association being fantastic, and for the conference being the most warm and welcoming financial conference you'll ever attend. Like warm and welcoming, I think, are not always adjectives I'd use to describe some finance conferences. The Financial Therapy Association is like a big hug. Please go, please go check it out. Wonderful, wonderful people. One of the things that I learned when training to be a psychotherapist, we did a lot of work around an awareness of, an appreciation for our own biases, our own, predispositions, and trying to keep from foisting our values upon those we serve. Now, whether we were able to do that is kind of up for debate. Like, I mean, you could make a pretty strong argument that you take them with you everywhere you go, and that therapists do a lot more proselytizing than they maybe cop to. But at least we were aware of it, right?
Right.
Compare this, though, to, I think, popular financial talking heads who are very transparent about their values. You think of people like Dave Ramsey or Susie Orman and these folks who sort of lead with their values and almost want to create an army of followers who share those values in some ways and very openly proselytize those values. How do you think about this for a financial professional? Which camp should we be in? Are we striving more to be in this sort of blank slate where we let others sort of bring their own values to the fore, or do we pound the table and say, this is how you do it?
Well, I think we'd have to back up and realize where our history comes from, because we really come out of a sales industry. We came out of insurance and stockbrokers, right? And over time, as I've listened to things over the decades, of course, we say, oh, no, we're fiduciary only. We don't sell. We're fee only advisors. But at the end of the day, we're still selling something. We're selling ourselves. We're selling advice. We're selling, and some are still selling product. And while that's not right or wrong, everything we do is made to show our value to our clients. And so one of the things I do in my teaching, as I'm teaching at these master level courses, and I work with a lot of professionals already in the industry doing this. And so what I have them do is kind of take a self-check. And exactly what you just said is, where are my biases? Where am I pushing someone that maybe I'm thinking this is how I get them to action orient something, but in all reality, they're not there yet. And is it me pushing them to a place I want them to be so that I can justify my cost or sell the product or whatever that is at the end of the day? And yet, the most important thing, if you're truly a fiduciary and trying to do what's best in the client's best interest, then you have to find out from the client. It can't be what you think is best and what you want to happen for that client. And so this is a really important part of financial planning. In fact, I'll refer you to Grable and Getz's book on communication for financial planners that I use in my class. And at the very end, they talk about biases. They talk about things that we need to do to reflect on ourselves and realize what you're doing in your communication, most of the time unbeknownst to us, right? This is either subconscious and not deliberate. We're not trying to push it, but we're trying to get them to an end goal. And when the clients don't progress as quickly as we want them to, sometimes we force that response in a way that really isn't in that client's best interest. So my antidote to that is, are you asking questions? Are you listening? The number one thing that I think advisors can do to improve not only their financial relationships, their relationships with their clients, but even their personal relationships is listen. And listening is a really hard skill for advice givers because we are taught to give advice. That is what we sell. That is what we do. That is who we are, is we tell people what to do. You should, you should, you should. Well, at some point in time, if we're really in the business of helping people, then we need to hear what that person wants. And so part of our job is not just listening, but helping guide them and look through what are their values. If I would argue that we talk a lot about values-based financial planning, right? But one of the things I would say is most of the time, clients don't walk in saying, hey, these are my values and this is what I want to do and this is how I want to spend it, right? So part of our guidance as a financial planner is to ask the right questions to find out, help them understand what their values are and how they want to spend their money and where they want to end up, and yet not projecting what we foresee. Often we'll say, well, what do you want to do in retirement? Does it look like you're sitting on a beach, or are you playing golf every day? But that's your dream, right? So instead of pushing them to one of those, there's many that talk about retirement, not wanting to retire in the traditional sense, and allowing clients to think through that. In psychology, we call this the miracle question. And that is giving people the space, taking them out of their current situation long enough to help them envision what a future could look like without a problem or an issue or something that's stopping them currently in the moment.
You talk this, this is fantastic. And I see that where we're paid ostensibly for giving advice, crunching numbers, setting goals, giving advice, giving you marching orders. But all of that is predicated on having listened enough to give the right marching orders. So it can be easy, I think, especially in a profession that is overwhelmingly male. This is something that men, can tend to do a lot. And it strikes me that another thing is that so much of communication and so much of listening is really attending to body language. Can you talk a little bit about body language and any ways that we can see that? Because this is, again, something that therapists are very comfortable doing, I think. And I think it's very weird for most other people to comment on other people's body language. I did this on a Zoom call the other day. A colleague of mine, I'm like, "Oh, you're smiling. Like, what's this smile about?" And they were like, "Oh God, it's hard to turn off your shrink senses." But I think this is something that therapists do that most other people would find a little uncomfortable. How can we sort of look for and call out body language en route to being better listeners?
Sure. And let me kind of accentuate that or finalize that last point. There's something in therapy that we call the stages of change or trans-theoretical model stages of change. And one of the key components, so there's 5 different areas and I won't go into them, but the one component is action. And so I think as financial planners, we think most people are ready to take action on their personal finances. And so we talk, and everything we do is really motivated to be in that action phase. And so we're really confused when clients don't take action on what we just told them to do. Because we set it out, we did a beautiful plan. So why is it not being implemented? Well, on the therapy side, as they've studied this over decades, what they have found is only 20% of people are actually in the action phase. Most are in what we call pre-contemplation or contemplation phase. I mean, pre-contemplation is not even thinking about it. In contemplation, you're starting to maybe think about it. So I would say that's one of the fallacies that we have inherently as financial advisors, is walking in, assuming people are ready to hit the ground running and make immediate changes. So it's important to take that pace at where they're at, and body language can be a key indicator of where they are in the process. Let me give you a very tangible example. I remember when I was at Kansas State, we were doing a study, and we had a couple come in, middle-aged, and they both had worked at a bank. So we assumed they had a pretty good understanding of basic financial matters. This is not a financial education or basic literacy need. But I remember as we walked in to sit down with them and start our conversations on their finances, and where a lot of it was financial infidelity and where this was taking place, I remember their body language. The husband sat on the far left side of the couch, and the wife sat on the far right side, and their bodies were turned completely away from each other. In fact, they would hardly look at the financial planner that was sitting in the middle of the room, trying to be almost a mediator in this. And their arms were crossed, their legs were crossed, they were tightly pushing. There was just kind of this feeling in the room of a sense of, I don't even want to speak. I don't want to be here with him or her, and I don't want to talk to them or have anything to do with them. We started working with them over time, and we would meet with them, these hour-long sessions. Usually we use solution-focused therapy, so it was usually about 4 to 6 sessions. And I remember very distinctively watching that body language change every session. And it was very incremental. In fact, I, as a financial planner, had not been trained to look for this. And so it was the therapist on the other side of the two-way screen that would point out to me and say, did you notice her? She, in fact, it was the wife in this case that slowly started to turn forward and even a little bit in towards her husband. And then eventually he uncrossed his arms and faced forward. And eventually over time, they got closer and closer. And I remember the day when they were finally sitting next to each other, still facing forward, but she reached over and set her hand on his leg. And that was the first time that I really thought, we're making progress. Like, just in the fact that she was finally willing to physically reach out meant that gap of the financial infidelity that had taken place had started to close. And I remember eventually by the end of our sessions, he had his arm around her, and they were sitting next to each other and communicating and able to communicate more openly. And so those type of subtle body language, whether it's, and let me use you another example too, when you're a planner and you're sitting across from that mahogany desk that we all have and know, you usually are sitting higher than the clients. You've got a barrier, which is the desk, in between you and the client. And often if you've got a screen, you probably have one spouse in a corner who can't see it. And that's usually your less dominant spouse, right, in financial matters. And so you usually end up talking just to the one person. Well, just the way that your office is set up may be off-putting and adding stress in a client's behaviors. We found this is true, especially research has shown that that's true, especially for women. And so redesigning that office to be more of an open, like you were talking about FDA, it's a warm, open, welcoming environment. That's what you want to be set up as well, so that they are able to openly share, and making sure that both spouses, if it's a marital situation, that both partners have equal standing, equal say, and equal time to ask questions. So if one person's not asking, ask them, talk to them, help them guide, because you may find out there's a lot more behind that iceberg that they're not opening up about.
Yeah, I feel like we live in a world where everything is so fractured and everyone's in such a big hurry that a lot of times when people are communicating, it's strictly functional. You're trying to get something done. You're trying to, make this exchange of information, and everyone's sort of listening with one ear closed and waiting to say their piece and waiting to speak. So if you can really listen, as you've talked about today, I think that's transformational. And then I think if you can listen and attend to body language, it's such an unusual experience for clients to be truly attended to be truly cared for and taken seriously, and to have all of their forms of communication attended to and taken seriously. But I think you'll have a client for life. So Dr. Mary, we've talked about all these things, and we've talked about, sort of us improving ourselves en route to being better financial planners. As practically as possible, if someone's listening to this and they want to do some work on themselves to be better at this, what are some practical steps they can take to be that superior next level financial professional?
Absolutely. Well, I think because we have emphasized listening so much, it would have to start there. And so if a small exercise that you can do is stop, and even in a recording yourself, if you're in a conversation or something else, you can stop and have that moment to reflect back. And if you've got it recorded, even better, because then you can hear how many times you interrupted someone, how many times you jumped in or maybe finished someone's sentence, or you aren't comfortable with silence. That's another thing that's really helpful, is using silence in a very strategic way, because it may be uncomfortable for you, but often there's things they're thinking about or they're processing, or there's reasons for why they are being silent on something. And so I would say the very first place to start is work on those listening skills. If you are listening and while someone else is talking, you're thinking of your answer, you are not listening. Truly listen. People want to feel heard. In fact, Maya Angelou, and I will not get this exactly right, but she has a wonderful statement that says, they may not remember how you made them. They may not remember what you said yeah, or what you did, but they will always remember how you made them feel. Right. And I think that is the key. So it's more important how the other person feels when they walk out of the room with you than it is of all the fancy spreadsheets you made or any other part that you're bringing to the table. Is how are you making that client feel? And if they feel heard, you'll be amazed at how well your rapport increases with that client and or spouse. Let's not even limit this to a client relationship, but even using this in your personal life can enhance your relationship with your kids, your spouse, your friends, every part of your life.
Yeah, I think sometimes in behavioral finance, we don't consider both sides of the coin. We talk a lot about how emotion drives bad behaviors, but a positive emotional experience, what shrinks call an emotionally corrective experience, right? This can be something that sticks with someone forever. And if someone has a positive emotional experience with a financial professional, that can really encourage them to stay with that person, to follow their good advice, to do a host of things. So emotion, just as surely as it can lead us to some dumb financial decisions, it can lead us down some really sound paths as well. Dr. Mary, you talked earlier about this being a sales profession, and now this is your chance to sell. You have a fantastic website. You have your own podcast. If people have learned a ton from you today, as I have, where can they find your work and learn more about what you're up to?
Absolutely. So my podcast is called Real Money, Real Experts, and it is with the executive director at AFCPE, which is the Financial Counseling and Coaching Association. And we teach a lot more of these skills at AFCPE. So feel free to get that wherever you get your podcasts, Real Money, Real Experts. You can also reach me on my website. It's Chief Financial Mom. So I have a blog and a podcast, or a blog and information for moms specifically on how to make better money decisions. And you can reach out to me there. I'm also on LinkedIn or Twitter or wherever you get your social media at Chief Financial Mom.
Awesome. Mary, thanks so much for all that you've shared with us today. You've been an incredible gift to all the listeners. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to Standard Deviations. If you can't wait till next week for more behavioral finance insights, visit www.orion.com. All opinions expressed by Dr. Daniel Crosby and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of or endorsement by Orion and its affiliates, subsidiaries, and employees. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for legal, tax, and investment decisions. The opinions are based upon information the participants consider reliable.